As a designer, the design and things that I make really don't matter. That is until someone sees it. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been working on the patient encounter flow for HealthcareOS, which is my product that is a next generation EMR, or electronic medical record. And during this process, I have been experimenting with different elements and different ideas for how to help clinicians process patients and get them ready for visits faster, more effectively, and to help them streamline their communication. 2 weeks ago, I was able to sit down with a clinician and get some really valuable feedback and do some light user testing on the designs to see exactly whether or not this product and the things that I was thinking about would be useful. Today I want to talk a little bit about my process for getting feedback from physicians, doing this user testing, if you will, and tell you a little bit about some of the insights that I've found from this process. Now, I haven't had a chance to actually implement any of these changes or ideas yet, so some of this is still a little bit up in the air, but I at least want to walk you through how I have gone about this process of collecting this feedback and what I intend to do with it and what the things I think were interesting that came out of it. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how to actually do user testing. Now, if you're working on any kind of product or website or anything like that, these steps can actually be really useful for you because it can give you a loose framework to use to gather feedback from people who will be using your product. My process from getting feedback from users is actually pretty lightweight. I try not to overcomplicate it because overcomplicating it could lead to kind of, at least at the stage that I'm in, overcomplicating it could lead to too many roadblocks in actually getting the feedback and implementing the feedback. So now the first step when doing some user testing or gathering user feedback is to identify your goals ahead of time. Now, this probably sounds a little obvious, but I want to dive a little bit into this. For me, when I was working with the patient encounter, my goal was to get a fairly generalized understanding about a couple things. How easy would it be to use this flow and the screens I've been working on? How effective would it be at helping a physician or a clinician, usually like a nursing staff or somebody like that, to actually gather the data? And then the third thing is, what was I missing? And this could be a goal of user testing, is to understand what you're missing or what you haven't thought about. The opposite can also be true, is that if you have too many things in there, that could be a goal as well. So the goal needs to be clarified. You need to have an understanding of what exactly it is that you want to get from your user out of this session. I try to keep it to 2 to 3 goals and have them prioritized basically in that order. Usually the goal of saying, like, is this going to work in the way that I think it is, kind of the effectiveness usually is kind of a default goal. So there's normally some kind of secondary goal I have that's more along the lines of, am I kind of solving the right problems, or am I asking the right questions about these screens? Now, this goal can also be related to the actual goal of the design, and in fact it should be. So if your goal with your design is to increase conversion, or to make something faster, or or to solve a problem in a novel way, your goal for user testing should probably be pretty related to that goal for the design. The second part of that goal setting is to prep questions and kind of understand what exactly you're going to look at. So for me, I had 4 screens that I was going to look at with this particular user, and I had a variety of questions about those screens, and a lot of them really came down to asking questions about how something would be perceived or how certain pieces of information are used on a day-to-day basis. So they're not just questions about, does this button make sense, which really shouldn't be a question anyway, but we'll get to that in a second. But it's more questions around the lines of, does it make sense to use a button for this type of action, or for this type of information, or this editing experience, or something like that. Now, the second part of that with the questions that you're going to prep is you don't want to prep leading questions. A question that could end in a yes or no answer is generally seen as a leading question. So if I'm going to try to gauge the effectiveness of, let's say, a form, I wouldn't ask the question of, does that button make sense? Which is probably going to prompt a yes question anyway, or a yes answer anyway. Rather, I'm going to say, how would you flow through this form? How would you get from this form maybe to the next page or the next set of questions or something like that? So a leading or an open-ended question is going to be much, much more effective at helping you gather the right types of information going in than a leading question will be. Now, once I've done that, going into the session, I always prep some context for the user. And I always say, when you're going to look at the screen, I want you to imagine you're in this type of scenario. So in this case, for this patient encounter, I said to the user something along the lines of, I want you to think about that this is like a nursing staff or maybe an MA or a PA who's going in and going to be getting the patient intake. And this is the first screen they see when they click into this experience. And then I would ask my first open-ended question, which is usually something along the lines of, what do you think you would do first, or what do you think you could do on this screen? Things like that. Those are pretty good open-ended questions because it gets their brain rolling, not just around what exactly am I going to do or what am I trying to accomplish, but what do I need to do in order to accomplish that? Usually, particularly in complex flows, you're not just thinking about one task. I'm going to go add something to cart. You're thinking about a series of tasks that lead up to that main task. So that often gets people thinking a little bit more deeply about what it is they're going to do leading into that. This is my kind of general framework for doing user testing. I'm going to prep questions or I'm going to prep a goal with some rough metrics ahead of time, prep questions in my rough agenda to cover and accomplish that goal. And then when I get into the session, I'm going to set up context first before I start asking questions. And I'm always going to ask open-ended questions as I'm going through the session with a user. Now, when I went through this session several weeks ago with this user, I found some pretty interesting insights from them about some of the screens that I showed. But there were actually two or three really interesting things that I found to be kind of insightful from this user. The first one was, generally speaking, about the flow. Now, the design that I have for the patient encounter uses what is generally referred to as a stepped navigation experience. You probably have encountered this when you signed up for a service online and you have different screens that are collecting different pieces of information. Usually you're going step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, and each of those screens, each of those things has a button to navigate, and you can usually go back and forth. These are pretty popular now on a lot of form filling websites like Typeform, and they're generally seen as pretty good for like onboarding experiences. And the reason is because they allow us to kind of subdivide and group like actions and not overwhelm a user with a ton of different pieces of information and inputs all at once. So my approach to the patient encounter, particularly with the patient intake flow, has been to use a stepped navigation experience. Each step in that process of taking vital signs, taking various parts of the history, doing the chief complaint, and then doing a summary and wrap-up, all of those are individual tasks, so in my mind they have made sense to be individual screens. But this user actually, we talked about the fact that that's actually not how it's done right now. You know, the segmented approach was something that was pretty novel to him, and him having actually used some of the biggest EMRs in the market, he was actually like, actually people don't really do this like this right now. But what he said was that this is actually not something that's done. Right now it's kind of all in one big screen, and you kind of have to figure out which sections that you're going to do and where you're going to do it, and then you kind of just update things as you go. And he said that this would actually be really great for one very important reason, which was that it helps create some standards in a practice. If you have one physician, maybe a handful of physicians who are kind of running the practice, and then you have a lot of maybe PAs or MAs who are doing intake, having this stepped experience actually creates some standard that can help them navigate this thing and learn it more quickly than if it was just one big screen with a big blob of information on it. So that was actually something somewhat surprising to me. The other big thing that was really useful and vital to me, and this is something that gets talked about quite a bit with EMRs, is the value of the click. One of the things, and if you're not aware of this, there's some crazy stats about how many clicks on average physicians have to do, or users have to do, to accomplish simple tasks in EHRs. And it's just this astronomical number of clicks. And so for the most part, we talk about the number of clicks when we talk about the measurement of the effectiveness of design in EHRs. And this actually came up quite a bit because we talked a little bit about not just with this kind of flow of moving between screens, but even with the table card design that I had shown several weeks ago to you all. We talked briefly about how much can you do without having to click additional buttons. And one of the things that we looked at was the card design, particularly with this medication, where we have some different actions for like refilling, changing a dose, discontinuing it, deleting it altogether, changing the pharmacy. Different things like that could be really useful, but all of them require an additional click and would theoretically require a transition to another screen. And his thing was, how can we do these things without having to press another button? So if I'm going to open a medication during this process of intake, maybe there is something that somebody is doing frequently. Maybe there's a singular action that's kind of the primary thing. Perhaps it's changing the dose, right? Or doing the refill. Now, refill is just one button, but maybe changing the pharmacy or something like that could be part of that. But maybe changing the dose. So maybe just listing out the other dosage formats that might be common for somebody with the attributes, the weight and the sex and all that of this person, the age of this person. Maybe changing the dose and just kind of recommending like the 3 best alternative dosage options in this card could be a really useful way of minimizing the number of clicks. One of the things that kind of came up in relation to this was, if I need to go off and go down this route of changing the dosage or doing a refill on a medication during this intake, suddenly I'm kind of doing this cognitive switch and going almost, as he put it, on a detour somewhere else. And he said, I don't want to take detours, which I found to be really interesting because right now in a lot of EMRs, the detour is kind of the way to get through all of these kind of subtasks of the main tasks on a day-to-day basis, if you will. So medication editing being a great example of this. Right now, in a lot of EMRs, to edit a medication, you have to go to a completely different screen. You can't do it from this intake area. So his thought was, instead of making me go do that, give me the functionality to do it right here. And that is, I think, really, really useful because this not just gets down to the quantity of clicks. We want to minimize the quantity of clicks in an EHR. But in addition to that, we want to increase the quality of the click. If you're going to necessarily need to click something, do that. Whatever it is that you're doing is a very valuable thing to do with that click, right? We don't want just to have to click to click to click to click. We want to click to do something very intentional. So this is a little bit about user testing, a little bit about user feedback, gathering that feedback, and some of the things that I found to be kind of interesting about the patient encounter that I've been working on recently. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you find it useful and valuable. If you do, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, and if you haven't already, I'd love for you to like and subscribe to the channel. I do these videos roughly once a week. I've been on the COVID train for the last 2 weeks or so I haven't been posting as regularly, but I'm hoping to be back to a more regular schedule in the next couple of weeks. So thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.